So this week we'll talk about multiple exposures, high dynamic range, or HDR, and panoramas. So it's week 11. So multiple exposures. In photography, double exposure or multiple exposure is a technique in which the digital chip is exposed twice to two different images. Or they can be images placed together in a photo editing program similar to Photoshop or Photoshop itself. So multiple exposures can show a progress of an event in steps over time. And they can also be used to superimpose two or more images to create unexpected relationships. So multiple exposure techniques. You can use the camera to do multiple exposures. Some cameras allow repeated exposures on the same frame, similar to this. So you can open the shutter and use the flash as a strobe technique with a repeating flash to expose the film or the chip as well. You can use that B or bulb setting, and the bulb setting stays open as long as the button is pushed down. And you need a dark or a black or dark working area, and this will allow you to fire off multiple exposures. And you can see here's an example of that. You can do it outside or in a larger room where the flash just won't hit that back wall. Now the drawback to this type of thing, and you can see it here, is where the images overlap, they become brighter and brighter and brighter. And again, if you remember back to the earlier lecture a couple weeks ago, the more you expose something, the brighter or whiter it gets, the less saturated it gets, and it becomes very bright. So other multiple exposures, you can create full images or ghost images. And ghost images are often used to create hoaxes. And you can see that people saying, oh, here is a ghost in my house, and here it's a wisp of smoke that the flash just happened to catch. When shooting multiple exposures, low, medium, or low light is best to create a good image. And here's an example of a 3-part image. And you can also see that his shoulder actually moved and it became a little bit of a shadow. And this is a multiple exposure where they actually placed the moon in this photo. And here is steps over time as the eclipse changed in the sky. They took the same photo multiple times, and then they merged them all together. Here's another multiple exposure, and again, the camera is probably placed. Well, it is placed on a tripod, and then the exposure is done a number of different times. Obviously, you can count. Now, so in this kind of image, when you shoot something like this, or say something like this, the overall image has to be exposed correctly. So to get multiple images on these types of photos, if you're exposing on a chip or the film all the time, you have to underexpose by a certain number, and those by underexposing the exposure will build until it's the right exposure. So in this case, it's just 2 images. So you underexpose by 1 stop, it's half the amount of light. You take the picture, then you have the person drive the tractor through, underexposed by 1 stop too. So because it's underexposed by, it has half the amount of light, half and half equal full, so it becomes a good exposure all around. Where he's only half exposed. So if it creates a ghost image. In this case, if we could count the number of guys it's probably in terms of double. So if you're doing 2 images, it would be 1 stop under. If you're doing 4 images, it's 2 stops under. If you're doing 8 images, it's 3 stops under. So if you're doing 16 images, it's 4 stops under. So you see, every time it's half the amount of light, so you're doubling the number of times you're going to have to expose. So making multiple exposures in your camera when overlapping, you calculate your exposure to determine the overall exposure. So calculating exposure, the basic rule of thumb for a double exposure is 1 stop down for a double exposure. Either you close the aperture, which is not recommended, it's usually your shutter speed, because when you close your aperture, your actual depth of field changes, so sometimes it's better just to adjust your shutter speed. Half the light would be 2 exposures to make a perfect exposure. Now, sometimes you have to use your aperture because you don't want the blur, but generally I try to use my shutter speed if at all possible. So here's how you're calculating, and I just went through this again, but I wanted to write it down as well. So 2 images is 1 stop under. 4 images is 2 stops under. 8 images would be 3 stops under. 16 images would be 4 stops under. 32 images would be 5 stops. So 6 stops would be 64. 7 stops would be 128 images. So that's an awful lot of images, but I'm just showing you it's double. Then it'd be 256, 512, 1048. So again, guy juggling, you can see it's exposed a number of times, his face becomes very white. And his hands in the middle area become very white as well. So if you wanted to if the images are not overlapping, let's say I shot a picture of myself on black right next to myself wearing let's say I'll wear a pink shirt on one image and it's a black background, and I'm going to put myself right next to it and wear a blue shirt. I can do that as long as they're not overlapping. It can be a full exposure, because if with a black background, there's nothing burning into that image because it's black. It's nothingness essentially in photography. So you could perfectly expose both images the same as long as they're not overlapping. Again, dark backgrounds. Same with the monkey going across. Their hands are barely touching if they are. Again, you could just shoot a perfect exposure each time because there's no overlap. Where if there's overlap, like in this one, again, you're going to have to calculate the exposure correctly. Otherwise, it's going to build until it's completely white. Unless you want that view. In this case, it worked really well because it's built it all around here, and then she looks really good here. So here's some multiple exposures. And again, you can see the little bit of overlap. It gets a little bit whiter. And here, this actually happened quite often in old-time photography, because what they would do is they would have a film back, and the film back would be into the back of the camera. They'd pull the slide out, they expose the film. They'd put the slide back in, pull the film back out, flip it around, and put it back in. Now, if you didn't put the slide in correctly, it would appear that the film wasn't exposed correctly, because on the old cameras, one side was silver and one side was black on the slide. The black meant it's been exposed, silver meant it's ready to expose. If you accidentally slid it in the wrong way, it would appear that the film was not shot, and sometimes they'd get double images, and this happened quite often. So, and here again, half and half. She's real light right here. She's half exposed. And the darker areas, you can see her a little better just because that's the way the characteristic of film. And here again, she just didn't move. You can see a little bit of blur right here. She stayed consistent. She shot a picture. Friend came in, went like this, shot a picture. Both halves made a full exposure. And here's some other examples of multiple exposure. And this one was shot on film. And this guy is very gimmicky. He's kind of funny. He was like the master or the of double exposure. He did a lot of tutorials on how to do it. What he actually did with this one, and it's pretty interesting, is he shot this picture, but he has a barn door thing that goes over his camera. So the top half, the door opens, and you shoot it, and you can shoot half the exposure. You close it up, and then you open up the bottom half, and you can expose it as well. So he is able to do 2 self-portraits of himself. So again, that overlap gets real bright. And you can actually see the different lines, the number of exposures. And this was put together most likely in some editing program, but very interesting. It gets bright. It's a very cool picture of a cat jumping. So this example, let's count out the exposures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 would be 2 would be 1 stop under. 4 would be 2 stops under. 8 would be 3 stops under. So they shot this picture 3 times and divided the exposures by thirds. And then so her actual face and body look pretty good. And then the arms are just slightly ghost-like because of the third of a stop. And again, another nice merging of 2 images together. So the next thing we'll talk about a high dynamic range, or HDR. If anyone has an iPhone, they'll notice that you can shoot HDR images automatically. It merges them and takes the multiple images all at once. So what high dynamic range is that imaging is a method that's used in imaging and photography to allow a greater dynamic range between the lightest and darkest areas of a print than just standard methods of photography. What that means is it takes the best parts of the bright areas of a dark photo and the best parts of the dark areas of a bright photo and merges them together and gives you a larger range of contrast than what your human eye or what regular photography sees. And here's an example. In high dynamic range, sometimes can get a bad rap. It gets sometimes people overdo it and it becomes real cartoony. So here's 2 examples of a scene shot in a traditional method and then in high dynamic range. So obviously the contrast is upped and the saturation is increased, and it just looks a little bit more interesting on a HDR image. Not that you want to do this to all images, but it can really enhance some of these images. So non-HDR pictures take all the pictures in one exposure with limited contrast range. The result is loss of detail in bright and dark areas of the picture, and depending on whether the camera had a high or low ISO or high or low exposure setting based on that. So this is what they shot. They shot 6 different images, you can see here, and they took the dark areas of the bright and the bright areas of the dark, and then they flip-flopped them, and that's how they stitched it all together to give a really nice tonal contrast range. So when looking at a scene, the human eye sees about 12 to 14 stops of light. An LCD usually displays about 9 stops of light, and a digital camera, a DSLR, has about 12 stops of light, depending on how you shoot it. Color negative film, which is the regular film that color film that most people use, has about 13 stops. So high dynamic range allows the contrast range to go beyond that human eye range. And this what happens. Sometimes the photos can look odd and almost cartoonish. So any camera that allows a manual over or under exposure of a photo can be used to create HDR. So pretty much every camera that I've encountered, they usually have an EV setting or a plus minus, and that allows you to underexpose, overexpose, or get it right on. And it usually is third stop increments. And most of them are usually all the way from 2 stops under to 2 stops over. So it allows you to do a really nice range. And Photoshop does a pretty good job of merging the photos together. There are other standalone programs out there that are made just for HDR, but there's so many different ones that I'm not going to cover any of those. But Photoshop does allow you to do a lot of that, so you don't have to necessarily buy some of those other ones. So shooting HDR, here's 7 steps. So you want to set your camera to a lower ISO if you can. The better quality, the lower the ISO. Usually 100 or 200 is great. Try using a wide-angle lens if you can. It's a little bit better. You don't necessarily have to do it, but wide angles tend to give you a little bit more working distance. Set your white balance. Auto is usually good. Presets are better because what happens is sometimes there might be a slight variant between shooting one picture to the second picture. So it's usually best to use a preset like, say, sunny or cloudy, or if you're inside, if you're using incandescent or fluorescent. You want to tend to set your actual preset in there. And this will eliminate any variation. So set your camera to either aperture priority or manual. And I tend to go to the manual side, but let me explain why you want to do aperture priority. So when you're shooting HDR, if you use aperture priority, you set the aperture, the camera will change the shutter speed. So the reason why you want to do that is you're merging all these photos together. If you have different focal ranges, like for depth of field, the editing program won't really know how to deal with it, and you may get some weird variations. So it's best to keep your depth of field the exact same in each one. So by doing that, you want to usually change your shutter speed over, say, your aperture when you're making different exposures. Shoot at least a 3 exposure bracket. The more, the better. Typically 5 is the best. 6 is probably better, but you usually should do 5. 3 is the bare minimum, but 5 is typically the norm. Many cameras have a bracket mode. You can just set it. Some of my cameras, I've never used that mode just because sometimes it's hard to get out of it, and you don't want to be shooting your photos later on and you're getting stop under, stop over, right on each time you take a picture. So I tend to just manually do it myself. So if you're shooting and you're worrying about camera shake, and you use a tripod, and if you are still a little worried about it, you can use your timer. So by using your timer on the camera, by the time you hit the button and the camera may be shaking a little bit, and by the time the timer goes off, the camera probably is still. So you could always use a timer if you're looking to keep that camera real still. So then you're putting it all together. Photoshop does a good job, but there are 2 really good standalone HDR programs. Photometrics is one Pro, and that Nik software, HDR eFlex Pro, is another one. Luminance HDR, it used to be called and I won't even pronounce that. But there is has a great free version. A lot of these programs, they change quite often and they get bought up by other programs. So if you're searching for it, you might find that it's called something else. But there's a lot of good different ones. I would just use Photoshop because I think it's really quite easy. And I will show you that later on. So here's an example of HDR. And this was shot with a camera raw. And the reason why they did this is obviously you can't shoot multiple photos of the same, of a car going this fast. So what they did is they shot it raw and then they adjusted the exposure in camera raw so they could get that high dynamic range. Because camera raw allows you a very large range as opposed to a straight JPEG. And this one doesn't look real cartoony, but the cool thing about this is if you've ever done any urban exploring or stuff, the shadows get really dark and it really is hard to see any of the cool detail and still see the highlights of the trees up here. So this takes this huge range that your eye probably doesn't even see the difference, can't even see, and then makes it so that you can see it really well. It's a very well done HDR image. Here's a more of a cartoony one, and you can start seeing a little bit of the glow around the edge of the bridge, but the clouds really become very dramatic in this type of HDR image. Here's another kind of a cool one, and this one you can see a little. You see a little expanded range here, but here the cool thing on top is it showed you they used 5 photos to make this particular image. Here's another kind of a neat thing. It's very cool expanded range. It looks pretty nice. And here's a black and white one. Very cool. Again, they did a lot of sharpening on these, so you see a lot of that high contrast. Here's a great sky. Nice fall color. You could really make this really pop even more, but they were going for the subtle look. Another really cool sky. Here's a subtle one that I shot a few years ago. Same with this one. I was going for the cartoony look. And this one I shot, and this is a couple different examples of different settings that are available in Photoshop. This is the old press room in the Times Herald building, and it's just some storage at the time, and they might even be cleaned out by now. But this is where the press actually stood, and you can see here, this area here. You walk along. The press was 2 stories. This actually had a decking here, so you could walk all the way around it. And this is the footings of where the press stood. So this is one HDR style. Here's another one. You can see how it gets a little darker and a little bit more contrasty. Here's more of a cartoony look. And again, all these were done in Photoshop. And then here's more of a flat. The detail's still there, but still a little bit more flat. And here you can still see some of the highlights out here and then some of the highlights in here. So it's a great example of different types of look. HDR can have a lot of different looks. Now here are 3 videos on HDR. I will place these on the bottom of this video page if you're interested in seeing them. Nikon has a good one on HDR, and it applies to all cameras, even though Nikon made it. Tony Sweet's HDR video is really quite interesting, and then here's just a detailed video on HDR on the top. So the next thing we're going to talk about is panoramas. So panoramas is just a wide-angle view or representation of a physical space, either painting or drawing or photography or a 3-dimensional model. And panoramas just are one of my favorite things. I love to shoot, but there's a couple of things about them that can make them either really good or really bad, and I'm going to talk about that. So So the next is how to shoot a panorama. So the main thing is you want to find a good location. So if you're doing a 360-degree panorama, and this is a case of this one, because this matches up to this side over here, you need to make sure that your location has something interesting on all 360-degree sides. So it's a great example of that is if you go down to the Blue Water Bridge and you shoot a panorama, the panorama of the bridge is great, but when you start shooting the back end of it, it becomes a lot of empty space because the sculptures are so far away, they become very small, and there's buildings, but they're very small. There's not a lot of interest behind it. So you need to make sure that you're set up in a location that has interest or interesting things around the whole 360. So then you need to determine what focal length to use. Most people think a wide angle is the best, but it's not. It may not be, especially if you're not shooting a 360-degree top to bottom panorama, a sphere. So if you're just shooting a strip and you don't care so much about the sky, or that, you may want to shoot more of a telephoto. And here's two examples. This is a little bit tighter shot than this one here. And it's the same scene, but this one has a lot more interesting things on the bottom. So in this case, you might want to do more of a wide angle. So if you have a tripod, use it if possible. Because if you don't, you want to be careful when you're shooting your panorama that or shoot it this way or shooting it this way, that you're not tilting one way or another, because when you tilt, you get what happens here. And your horizon line will actually start going like this. And you can fix that in Photoshop, but it's a lot easier if you're just to shoot it the right way the first time. So most tripods have a level on the head of them. So if they don't, you just bring a little level and level the head so that when you actually turn the tripod, that you're spinning in a nice even horizon line. So instead of going, like this, because if it's tilted, you're gonna have the camera go like down like this and then back up and then over, and it's gonna make a very strange and odd horizon line. So take multiple photos and overlap. So this is a key. And you'll notice, and I'll talk about this in a couple slides, is these are vertical pictures. So what you want to do is you want to overlap your image by a third or 30%. So when your photo merging software, in our case we're going to use Photoshop, requires you to generate and stitch it all together, a generous overlap makes it a lot easier to match things, and it will use parts of them to make the best image possible. So if you just have them shoot real close, it may have broken lines and things, but if you overlap, the Photoshop can determine, or whatever stitching program you're using can determine what part of the image to use. The fifth thing is just set your white balance, because if you don't set your white balance, every time the photo is taken, it analyzes a scene. If the scene is overly green, it's going to add red. If it's overly yellow, it's going to add blue, and you get odd color shifts. So don't use automatic mode. Set your camera to a camera preset, like say sunny or cloudy. If you're inside, you could use incandescent or fluorescent. But if you set your presets, it's not going to have a lot of variation. Now, Photoshop, and especially the last version, has gotten a lot better at analyzing that and adjusting the color. And there's some paid HDR programs out there that do a really great job at that. But if you shoot it the right way in the first place, you don't have to worry about it. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money on a program. So the sixth thing is use manual exposure mode. This is similar to the white balance. So for the best results, you want a consistent exposure all the way through. If you shoot a bright area, let's say the sun is setting on one side, if you want to do a test and make sure that you get the best exposure overall, you have to average the front and the back, but yet you don't want to blow out the front, so you have to do tests. So you will want to keep your exposure consistent. So you'll want to set it to manual and shoot every picture the exact same exposure. So the seventh thing, and I alluded to this earlier, is you want to shoot vertical images because it doesn't matter how wide something is because you're overlapping. You might as well get the most of your camera, shoot vertical, then you get more of a wide from top to bottom. And then just shoot overlap. And that means you might have to shoot more images than if you shot wide. Horizontal, but that's okay. You're already going to be merging them together anyways. So rotate around the camera, not you around you. So in this case, if you look at A here, the person's in the middle and they're rotating the camera. That's not what you want to do. You want to rotate around your camera because your camera should be the pivot point for a panorama, so that means your lines will match up. If you're shooting panoramas far, far away, this is not as important as if you're shooting lines really close. Because actually, if you're shooting lines that come right up to it, or you're shooting a 360-degree panorama, you'll need another piece of equipment, and you'll have to find something on your lens I'll talk about later on. You have to find that middle part, which is called the nodal point. So. And here, I talked about it here. You'll want you might want to get a panoramic head for your tripod, which will rotate around. And that's this one this next one here. So if you are really serious about shooting panoramas, you might want to get a piece of equipment that does this. It shoves the camera back, and it finds there's ways of finding that nodal point or that middle part of your lens, and then it rotates around the middle part, and it makes for a very seamless panorama. Very well done, especially easily done for really close-up photos. Again, if your panorama is far away, this is not as important. So here's some different panoramas. Again, these aren't 360. They're probably, close to 180s. Here's Rio de Janeiro. You can see the Christ up here. Sugarloaf here. And like things like this, you'd start needing to use that panoramic head and find your nodal point on the lens because you're getting pretty close. And to have a consistent line throughout here, that becomes really hard. This is one of my favorite ones, and this is a great example of a very, very wide angle panorama. So this is actually in Chernobyl. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me through the Canvas email system or ask me questions in the discussion. If you need help for any reason, just contact me and I can work through Teams and we can figure out if you have any issues. Have a great week.